Good morning, econ students. This is part 4 of economics for students who are studying during a period of quarantine. Today, we are mostly just doing some financial literacy stuff, but it also gives us a chance to introduce T-charts. And T-charts are an important part of the banking sector. So we'll come back in a later video to do T-charts and banking. Right now, though, a brief intro to a T-chart. T-chart gets its name for its shape, and we can set this up in a couple different ways, but let's do a quick example where we have income versus expenditures. And this is the kind of thing that an accountant might do when working for a business, or an individual might do something like this for their monthly budget. So let's imagine that we're doing a monthly budget for you for just after you leave college and you start your first career. If we're looking at your monthly budget, when you start working, let's assume that you make $48,000 per year. That seems reasonable to me for a first job these days. Plus, it divides nicely by 12. So if we did that for a monthly income, 48 over 12 would give you income of $4,000 per month. But that's your gross income. So taxes have to be taken out of that. And if you are solidly in the middle class, making around 50,000 a year, you will lose about a quarter of your money to taxes. And so what looks like a $48,000 salary is actually like a $36,000 salary, or $3,000 per month. The general rule is you want to make sure that your income is larger than your expenditures. If you had expenditures larger than your income, you could probably get away with that in the short term as you run up like a credit card bill, but eventually the bills are going to come due. And so the goal is to spend less than you make. For most people, the biggest line under expenditure will be the cost of their housing. Housing is expensive everywhere, but especially where we live here. The general recommendation from financial experts is that you should not spend more than 40% of your income on housing. Where we live here, I know a lot of people who spend more like 50% of their income on their housing because housing is just so expensive here. So if you follow that trend, then you lose 1,500 right away for your mortgage payment or rent. It's actually pretty close to that in this area as well, even for like a simple 2-bedroom apartment. And so there goes half your money. After that, of course, you have other deductions for, of course, like, you need insurance on your car and on your house and on your life. You need to take out more money for utilities. You need to take out more money for gas. You need to take out more money for groceries. Maybe you have a little bit of money left over for things that you want to buy, clothes or restaurant meals or experiences of some sort. And so, in short, your $3,000 is going to mostly get eaten up pretty quickly here. If you're being responsible, you would design your expenditures in such a way that you're able to put away a couple $100 a month at least in your savings. And a couple $100 doesn't sound like a lot, but we'll come back in a later video and show how a couple $100 per month accumulates and becomes really significant thanks to compound interest and long periods of time. Doing T-charts for AP Macro, when we get to banking, we're not going to set it up with income and expenditure. Usually we're going to be doing it like this. We'll do assets versus liabilities. Assets would be things that you possess. Liabilities would be all of the money that you owe. And again, we want to make sure that your assets are larger than your liabilities. And let's do just personal finance stuff with this right now, but we'll come back and take a look at banking T-charts in a later lesson. Right now, if we're considering the assets that you have, probably as a teenage student, you probably have a phone, you might have a computer, you have a couple things in your closet that might have value if you were able to take like some clothing to a resale store or something like that. Or maybe a couple of nice pairs of shoes. I don't know. You probably don't own that much. Maybe a bicycle. Some of you might have a car. So you don't really have any assets that are significant, but you also probably don't have any liabilities. Most of you probably do not have a mortgage. You probably don't have large recurring payments of any sort. You probably don't have a credit card yet. Um, some of you might have a car payment on a car loan. But right now, most of you probably have a little bit of net worth. If we were to take a look at all of your assets and then subtract your liabilities, that gives us your total net worth at this point, which for many of you might be a couple hundred or maybe a couple $1,000s. But as a teenager, your T chart isn't very complicated or exciting. So let's again go to after college. Once you start working, let's say when you're in your 20s, you start to accumulate more and more assets. You'll accumulate, for example, a house. But as you buy a house, most people can't buy a house with cash because they don't have, $250,000 in a banking account. So when most people buy a house, they end up with a huge liability here, and that would be their mortgage. And this is the loan that you get from the bank in order to pay for the house. Again, your assets should be larger than your liabilities, and so let's imagine you bought a house for $300,000. In this area, that's actually probably a steal. That might be a fixer-upper. But you have to make a down payment on the house, and so your mortgage is going to be a little bit less than $300,000 even from the start. Maybe your mortgage is like $280,000. Over time, if you're lucky, the value of your house goes up. Meanwhile, the value of your mortgage goes down as you make payments on it. And so if we were to come back and look at this T chart again after a couple of years, you might have a house that is gaining value. And perhaps if all goes well, you have a house that has become $350,000. Meanwhile, you might have a mortgage that is down to $250,000 as you made payments on it. And if this was everything that was in your T chart, we could say that 350,000 minus 250,000 gives you $100,000 as your net worth. If your assets are larger than your liabilities, you could always borrow more. If this was your situation, you could go to the bank and you could say, look, I only owe this much. Meanwhile, my house is worth that much. And you could actually take out another $100,000 loan. And you could use that loan maybe to start a business or do something like that. But the downside of doing that would be you are then risking your house. And if you ever got to the point where you could not repay that loan, the bank would expect you to sell your house in order to pay off the mortgage and the other loans that you might have. If we look at recessions, or just when personal tragedy strikes, sometimes people have medical expenses, or they are unable to work for some reason. It's possible that people end up in a situation where their assets are smaller than their liabilities. Let's imagine that as a recession hits, that house that you thought was going to be $300,000 or $350,000, it actually loses value because nobody is buying houses. And so your house has fallen in value to $200,000. In this case, if your mortgage was $250,000, but your house is only $200,000, you have a problem. If you tried to sell the house, you wouldn't even be able to pay off the mortgage. You have net worth that's negative at this point. Most people, when they find themselves in this kind of unfortunate circumstance, they would declare bankruptcy. Bankruptcy isn't just an adjective we use to describe poor people. Bankruptcy is a legal definition. And when you declare bankruptcy, basically you end up going to court, and the judge will allow the banks to seize all of your assets. And the bank will sell your assets in order to try to pay off all that you owe. And so you lose your house and your car and whatever else you might own. And when you declare bankruptcy, you end up with a blank slate. You end up with no assets of any real value, but you also end up with no liabilities. You go back to nothing and nothing. But this comes with a punishment. If you declare bankruptcy, you're looking at 7 years where you're not allowed any liabilities. You can't get a car loan, you can't get a mortgage, you can't get a credit card. So you would need to work and start building up assets without any liabilities at all. After 7 years, you can then qualify again to get a car loan or a home loan or a credit card. but that's the punishment that comes with declaring bankruptcy. Now, there's one more important idea for all of you when it comes to bankruptcy, and that is there is a liability that never goes away. Many of you are about to take out tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. And we just saw your T chart a moment ago. You don't have the assets to back up $50,000 in student loans or whatever it might be. And so student loans have their own rules. Basically, if student loans didn't have their own rules, then there would be a market failure and nobody would be able to get a student loan. Consider this possibility. If student loans could be wiped out by declaring bankruptcy, then a lot of students would take out a huge amount for student loans. They would run up a huge debt. Since they have no assets worth seizing, when they graduate from college, they would declare bankruptcy. The student loans would get wiped out, and 7 years later, they would be able to start building credit again. But that would be much easier for most people than actually paying off the student loan, which most people aren't able to do in as short a time as 7 years. Since banks can't tell which young people are likely to cheat in that way and which ones are honest and would repay the loan, since they can't sort out the lemons versus the peaches, this should sound like something that we learned back at the beginning of the year in microeconomics. We're dealing with an issue here of asymmetrical information. And since students don't have any assets, and since banks can't tell which ones are actually going to repay the loans, in a completely free market for student loans, banks wouldn't be able to give student loans to anybody, and far less people would be able to get a college education, and we would have a market failure. So anyway, student loans come with their own rules, and the rules are even when you declare bankruptcy, you keep the student loans. You will always have to pay those off. You can't just wipe that out. But that is a regulation that was passed in order to make sure that that market failure didn't exist. Wrapping this up, we're going to get into the exciting idea of like stocks and bonds and 401k plans in the next short video. But I want to just wrap this up with the idea that when we do net worth, if we're doing our assets minus liabilities to find our net worth, there are some interesting statistics that are worth sharing. The median family in the U.S. has a net worth of $97,000. This means that if all went terribly and they needed to sell off all of their assets in order to pay off their liabilities, they would still be left with $97,000 extra dollars in their pocket. But interestingly, this is not the same for all racial groups in the United States. The median white family has a median net worth of $171,000. If we're looking at the median Hispanic family, they have net worth of an average $20,000, and the median Black family today has a net worth of just $17,000. I just want to leave it today with a couple thought-provoking questions. When we look at this issue of net worth by race, I would just ask you, what historical circumstances do you think have contributed to these vast differences between racial groups? Question 2, should the U.S. government be involved in addressing these inequalities? And if you believe that the U.S. government should be involved, then the question 3 would be, what policies would you recommend in order to address these differences for wealth among different racial groups? I don't know what the answers are to those questions, but feel free to comment either with this video or in our discussion board on Blackboard. With that, I want to bring this video to a close. And the next video we'll be looking at, like I said, stocks and bonds and other financial assets.